The US entered the post-World War II period with absolutely two different kinds of approaches. One was to build a true international law and international institutions, and the second was to be a superpower. And these were always in some conflict with each other. But there was a time, for a long time, I would say, where the UN was respected by American politics. And the idea was we should strengthen the UN and UN agencies. The US had a lot to do with building a lot of the UN agencies like the World Health Organization and others after World War II. But over time, as US power increased, and especially at the end of the Soviet Union, when the US strategists said, you know, we're the sole superpower, we have no challengers, we can do what we want. Then they started to look at the United Nations merely as a nuisance. And here were all these new post-colonial countries saying we need a fair international system, and the United States would say, don't talk to us about fairness, we'll decide what fairness is. And so over time, the US political elite started to view the UN maybe as a place to spread US propaganda, but not as a vehicle of global problem solving. And if you look at objective data, the US is the country in the world probably least aligned with the UN Charter right now. I've created with my colleagues a multilateralism index to see who actually sides with the global majority, who actually follows the UN institutions, who signs UN treaties and so on. The US comes out at the end of the list, not at the front, at the back, the least aligned country with the UN Charter. What the US started to do was to say, we will create an alliance. We will create a group of allies and friends. So this became the expression, not the UN, but allies and friends, allies and friends, allies and friends. And this meant military allies, of course. This meant NATO. And the mindset is completely us versus them. It's the US versus China. How dare China be so large and successful? We're the only superpower. So that became the US mindset. Now, it would be a tragedy if China took the view, well, the US has its alliance, now we'll have our alliance. In other words, dividing the world in two. Probably China would have the larger part of world population and so on. You look at the BRICS today, for example, they are about 36% of world output compared to 29% of world output of the G7 countries. But the idea should not be the US has its alliance, we need our alliance for our security or to save the world from the US alliance. In my opinion, but a strongly held view, I'm hoping that China will continue to do what it's been doing, to say the US has its allies and friends, we have the UN Charter, we have international law, we want multilateralism of everyone, including the US. We don't want to have two blocks. We don't want block politics, because I believe China's statecraft is fundamentally different from Western statecraft. Western statecraft is always us versus them. It's always a fight. It's always a war of all against all. If you listen to the realists, it's an anarchic world system, the way they call it, because they say there's no overarching power, so it's anarchy. But Confucian thought is something very different. Confucian thought is that's not anarchy. You need virtue. You need principles to live, and that can be what holds us together. So we don't need one dominant power. We don't need one hegemon. We need decency. We need virtue. We need proper behavior. This is what I hope China leads the world in showing, that this quote, realist model is not the only model of statecraft. The idea of war of all against all is not the only model. And that in fact, and I'll just summarize here, the United Nations will be 80 years old next year. That's not a lot of time in human history. We've only had 1 century so far of attempting international law. It started with the League of Nations, which didn't work. Now we have the UN, which is very fragile, and the US has increasingly turned its back on its own creation. But I don't want to give up on the UN. And I believe that for China's interest, by the way, interest as well as its vision, a strong UN system is the right kind of system. The United States does not recognize the doctrine of non-intervention. The United States is the #1 user of sanctions, not UN sanctions, US unilateral sanctions. That is intervention in other countries' affairs. The United States funds agencies like the National Democratic Institute and others to actually get into the internal politics of other countries. Are you kidding? Handle our own politics. We have enough problems agreeing on anything inside the United States. Don't meddle in the internal affairs of other countries. And the United States has 750 overseas military bases. What I propose is we end all overseas military bases, all of them. You know, if your naval vessel needs refurbishing in a naval yard, doesn't have to be an overseas naval base to do it. We could get along better if we didn't have all of this massive 80 countries of overseas US military bases where the US meddles in the internal politics just about every place where it has a military base, because then the US strategy says, oh, we don't want to get kicked out of here. We need a government that doesn't want to throw us out. But this government says, we don't want you here. Oh, maybe we have to have a regime change operation in this country. And so this is very destabilizing. China can be, should be a bulwark along with all the rest, and teach the US also, abide by international law, abide by the doctrine of non-intervention, abide by virtue and harmony in international relations. It doesn't have to be a war of all against all. It should be harmony because we have enough to do together that we don't need this constant provocation, which is unfortunately what has become US foreign policy.